All right, welcome to the Social Studies webinar on using the distance learning packets in the classroom. This webinar is meant for teachers who are teaching in an in-person setting and would like to use the distance learning packets instead of the materials they would typically use to teach the covered topics. Here's the agenda for this webinar. We will start by going over our goals and how those relate to the overall vision and instructional shifts for social studies. We will then discuss what adaptations should be made to the distance learning packets for in-person use and how to make those adaptations. We will close with some next steps. In our first social studies distance learning webinar, we provided an overview of the distance learning packets and the general guidelines for how to use them in various settings. This webinar will discuss more in-depth how to use the distance learning packets in a classroom setting, specifically by making adaptations on how the sources are explored and how and when to include student deliberation and discussion. No matter what setting we are teaching in or what materials we are teaching from, the social studies goals and instructional shifts should be what drives all of our instructional decisions. And here are those goals and shifts. Right? So if our goal is to graduate knowledgeable students who can express reasoned arguments, we must plan lessons that allow students to explore complex sources, do the majority of thinking and speaking, and practice using evidence to support their claims. So before we get too much further, we should discuss what the distance learning packets are. The distance learning packets were originally created to support teachers who were teaching in a distance learning setting by providing them plans that would cover one topic in a unit, and at the same time providing a model of what distance learning instruction could look like, so that the packet covering that one topic could be used as kind of a cornerstone to build other topic coverage from. If you are teaching in a regular classroom setting and not doing distance learning, you can continue to teach social studies using the resources you've been using, provided it's been successful, or you can use the distance learning packets, which can be adapted for in-person instruction. This webinar has been created in response to requests for more support on how to adapt these packets for classroom use. Okay. Many of the social studies instructional shifts are already present in the distance learning packets. The framing and supporting questions engage students in a compelling inquiry. Each lesson in the packet includes a variety of high quality and complex sources, including primary and secondary interpretations. And there are opportunities for students to develop and express claims through the formative and summative assessments, which typically take the form of a constructed or extended response. There are also some item sets present. The distance learning packets were designed for independent, low-tech distance learning, which by its very nature entails a lot of independent reading and writing. While independent reading and writing is definitely a part of excellent social studies classrooms, it ought not to be the entire class period. Because of this, meaningful adaptations must be made to distance learning packets if they're going to be used in person. The meaningful adaptations we will be discussing in this webinar are adaptations to how sources are explored and how student deliberation and discussion can occur. All right, so adapting student engagement with sources. So since the distance learning packets were designed with low-tech learning in mind, the only method in which students explore sources is independently. Let's talk about why it is important for students to explore sources in more ways than just independently during an in-person instruction. Many students will need more support in accessing the information contained in any given source in order to build the intended knowledge. We can provide this support by making adaptations to the way the source is presented to students. Meaningful adaptations can also emphasize collaborative learning between students. While independent work definitely has a time and place, there should always be options in every social studies classroom for students to work together and to learn from one another. So let's discuss some suggested adaptations. When to use them. First, when it comes to visual sources here. The first suggested adaptation is to just project the image and explore it as a group. Not only does this save on paper, this allows students to build knowledge together through group analysis. The teacher can lead this analysis by using the guiding questions that come with visual sources in the packet. And they can also use the visual analysis tool that's included in the scope and sequence. Projecting the source and analyzing it together can be used with a single visual source or with a bank of image sources, which appear pretty frequently in the distance learning packets. Another suggested adaptation for exploring sources is to implement a gallery walk. During a gallery walk, students rotate around the room to explore visual sources as a group. They can read accompanying captions and discuss the guiding questions that go with the source. This strategy allows students to analyze the source with their peers, helping them to further refine their thinking. Again, this strategy can be used with the image banks as well. All right, let's discuss some suggested adaptations for text sources. The first adaptation we will discuss is implementing partner reading. Partner reading is a cooperative learning strategy where two students read a text together. One student listens, the other student reads. They take turns switching roles. Partners should be selected by identifying which students require help on specific skills and who the most appropriate student is to help other students learn those skills. Implementing this adaptation helps learners in building knowledge from the source and emphasizes collaborative learning. The next adaptation we will discuss is shared reading. This is a reading strategy where the teacher and students each complete part of the reading. This strategy provides more support than partner reading and therefore should be used on longer, more complex sources or potentially the shorter sources that are extremely high complexity, such as some primary source excerpts. This is particularly applicable to the elementary grades. The next adaptation we will discuss is the teacher read aloud. Read aloud is a strategy that provides the most support for learners in building knowledge from the source, and therefore should be used only for the most complex sources. While the teacher is reading aloud, they should be dropping in definitions for different vocabulary. We suggest and point out some vocabulary in the distance learning packets. The teacher should be, modeling and thinking aloud during these kind of pre-planned places in the text, and asking students questions that will support them in their understanding of the source as they continue to build knowledge. During the read aloud, students should be tracking the text and answering teacher questions in either writing, like by doing a stop and jot, or with each other, using a think, pair, share, or a similar strategy. After the source is read aloud, the teacher should direct students to reread either individually or with a partner, with a specific purpose. This could be to answer guiding questions that accompany the source in the distance learning packet, or to complete a specific analysis strategy, such as OPVL, which you can find in the scope and sequence. Okay, that covers our discussion of adapting the sources. Now let's talk about student discussion. The purpose of discussion in social studies is to refine and extend student thinking. Since discussion is not included in the distance learning packets, adaptations must be made to include it when using them for in-person instruction. In this section of the webinar, We will talk about how to use the questions that are included in the distance learning packets and to make adaptations for classroom instruction. There are two main types of questions that are included throughout the distance learning packets: guiding questions and after you read questions. In the packet, students are directed to independently write responses to these questions, but when making adaptations for in-person instruction, the guiding questions and after you read questions can be turned into class discussion questions. Guiding questions are included with most sources, both text and image sources. And their purpose is to highlight important understandings from the source to better ensure that students are building knowledge. Guiding questions can be discussed as a class, and typically these would be brief discussions to make sure that students are pulling out the knowledge that's intended from that source. The second type of question included in the packets are after you read questions, which are usually 2 to 3 questions at the end of a lesson that require students to synthesize information from multiple sources. Discussing these critical thinking questions can support students in developing their claim on the packet's framing and supporting questions. So let's discuss some suggested adaptations and when to use them. Discussion in social studies can be quick, with the intention of checking for understanding to make sure the intended knowledge was built, or longer, where a full classroom discussion is used for students to discuss multiple sources and to synthesize that information. A quick classroom discussion can be conducted after exploring the source using the guiding questions associated with that source from the packets themselves. Strategies such as think, pair, share can be used to ensure more students do more of the thinking and speaking. Since the after you read questions come at the end of a lesson, they lend themselves better to be used as full classroom discussions. Since students have been building knowledge from multiple sources throughout the lesson, a full class discussion supports students in synthesizing that information, weaving it together, and developing their claims. Students can prepare for a longer discussion by drafting answers to the after you read questions before the discussion takes place. In addition to classroom discussion, classroom debate holds a valuable place in social studies. Deliberation and discussion can help students refine their thinking and develop their claim, but debate can be a way for them to express it. Classroom debates, such as Socratic seminars or philosophical chairs, which I'm a big fan of, can be done in place or in addition to the summative assessment essay from the distance learning packets. Okay, so now that we've learned why it's important to make adaptations to the distance learning packets when we're using them for in-person instruction, and we've looked at what those adaptations could look like, let's look at an example of what the kind of decision-making process for adapting might look like. Now that we have explored the process of how to strategically plan for students to engage with sources in class and how to implement classroom discussion, we will practice making these adaptations to a distance learning packet. So for this example, we're going to be using a 3rd grade distance learning packet, specifically from Unit 2, the packet that covers Indigenous cultures in Louisiana. The focus of these examples is going to be on why the adaptations were made, not necessarily the chosen content itself, as the goal is to set you up to make meaningful adaptations of your own. So before we continue with this webinar, please pause and access the Social Studies resource page on Louisiana Believes and download Grade 3 Social Studies Distance Learning Packet, the student materials for Unit 2. And, pause me here and unpause when you're ready to move on. Okay, we're back. So first, we're going to practice making strategic adaptations to how sources are explored. The source we will use as an example when practicing for this is source H. So locate source H in the third grade packet, Unit 2, Indigenous Cultures of Louisiana. It's a text source. It's actually a secondary text called Poverty Point Culture by Rebecca Saunders. With permission from the publisher, 64parishes.org, we have adapted this source to make it more accessible to a third grade reading level. This is a complex text source due to the length and the vocabulary. So with all sources in these packets, the text, it must be read beforehand. So in order to strategically plan for how students are going to engage with it in class, let's pause and please read through source H. Okay. So to best inform how students should engage with source H, it is important to know what knowledge students should be learning from this source and how this source will help them ultimately answer that supporting question that it falls under. So this source in that packet falls under the supporting question, what are the characteristics of the prehistoric cultures of Louisiana? So again, please pause the webinar and discuss or write down what knowledge, discrete bits of knowledge that students should be pulling out of source H. Okay, let's see. So this is not an exhaustive list, but students should be learning the following from this source. So specifically, that Poverty Point was a mound building culture in Northeast Louisiana. The mounds built were the largest of their time period. Trade was a very important characteristic of Poverty Point. Stone materials were traded for feathers and hides, etc. What we know about Poverty Point really comes from our study of the artifacts. And these artifacts include things like special kinds of bricks, stone ornaments, beads, and even food remains. All right, so now that we know the knowledge that students are going to build, let's think about the best way for them to engage with this text. So please pause the webinar again, and thinking about the adaptations that we covered earlier, discuss how students should engage with source H. Take a moment, and when you're ready, unpause. So, because source H is a more complex source, it's got, it's a little long, it's got pretty difficult vocabulary, it would be appropriate to assign for partner reading. Since there should always be a goal for reading and working with a partner, the teacher should tell students to set them up to read with the goal of answering the question. It's one of the guiding questions. What kind of artifacts have archaeologists recovered from Poverty Point, and what do they tell us about their community? While partner reading is a good option for source H, teacher discretion and knowledge of their students in the classroom should really, that's what should inform your choice of how students should engage with the text. For a class needing more support, it could be appropriate for the teacher to read this text aloud, providing vocabulary definitions as they read, pausing to ask questions to build knowledge, asking students to reread sections of a text with a partner, teacher discretion. Now that students have engaged with source H to build knowledge, let's talk about adaptations that could be made to include student discussion. As we learned earlier, discussion is an important way to support students in refining their understanding, developing claims, and ensuring that students are doing the majority of the thinking and speaking. All right, so again, please pause the webinar for a moment and discuss how discussion could be used to implement this source. So one way student discussion could be done is to have students do a think, pair, share on the guiding question at the end of source H, then call on a few students to share out their answers with the entire class. The teacher might even decide to record students' answers, ending up with a list of artifacts found at Poverty Point and what they tell us about the Poverty Point community to help students in solidifying the knowledge that should be built from the text. Another way to implement classroom discussion after source H would be to implement a full class discussion using the after you read questions. This discussion would come after students have finished engaging with source I as well. The after you read questions are included at the end of most, but not all, lessons in the distance learning packets. They are designed to be more challenging for students in that they ask students to analyze information learned over more than one source and to synthesize that information. The after you read questions are good questions for full class discussions because they come at the end, so students have had opportunities to already refine their thinking. Students can prepare for an after you read discussion by jotting down responses to the questions. And once again, the teacher could use a discussion tracker to chart student participation, even for a grade if they so choose. All right, a quick note on another adaptation at your disposal, and that would be adding multimedia sources. While these can't be used in a low-tech distance learning environment, which is what the packets were originally intended for, but videos and online interactives can definitely be used in the classroom, and not only to engage students, but to actually support in building more knowledge on a topic. The more knowledge a student has on a topic, the more accessible the text is going to become for them. Multimedia sources can build knowledge on a topic, better engage students, making those longer, more complex text sources more accessible. Multimedia sources can also provide an important support for EL students and diverse learners. They can be found in the scope and sequence or occasionally in the distance learning extensions, in the distance learning packets themselves. Here are two examples of multimedia sources from a third grade Indigenous cultures topic. So in lesson 1, students could watch a video on what archaeology is before reading that text on the same topic. And in lesson 3, they can engage with an online interactive on Poverty Point called Rivers as Roads. Now, this one is really, really cool. This is a new resource produced by the Louisiana Division of Archaeology and can be helpful in building knowledge about Poverty Point and engaging in an engaging way in advance students on their reading of the text on Poverty Point. All right. Now that we have fully discussed all the adaptations needed to use the distance learning packets in an in-person setting, let's discuss next steps in implementing what you've learned today in your classroom. As you are planning to implement the distance learning packets, make thoughtful and meaningful adaptations to the way students explore each source, both visual and text. Include classroom discussion and deliberation where appropriate. Include multimedia sources. In addition to making these adaptations, continue to use the distance learning packets in a structure that has students engaging in compelling inquiry, learning content through the exploration of high quality, complex sources, and developing and expressing claims. Finally, let's talk about how to implement these previous steps. You should determine when and how adaptations will be made before starting instruction. It is recommended to make adaptations for the entire topic before starting to teach it. It is encouraged to use any shared or co-planning time if possible. Classroom observations and student data can be used to make informed instructional decisions. All right, before we close out, here are some helpful links to resources as well as general ways to contact the department for any questions you might have. The slide deck for this webinar will be uploaded to the distance learning section of the K-12 Social Studies resource page, and all hyperlinks can be accessed there. In closing, thank you for all you do for the students in Louisiana, especially in these unusual and challenging times. The work of educators is valuable beyond measure. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out by emailing us at classroomsupporttoolbox@la.gov. Take care, everyone.